Eye in the Sky Media.
Part 1: The Double Life of Sergei Skripal. The city of Kaliningrad, nestled on Russia's Baltic coast, was once a stronghold of Soviet pride, where loyalty to the state was bred like steel. That's where Sergei Viktorovich Skripal was born in 1951. A serious child raised under the shadow of Cold War discipline, he grew up destined to serve something greater than himself, the Soviet military. And he did just that. Skripal climbed the ranks of the Soviet army, eventually becoming a senior officer in the GRU, the shadowy military intelligence wing of the Soviet Union. It was the GRU's job to know everything, and to ensure that others knew nothing. As the years passed, Skripal became an expert handler of secrets, identities, and deception. He wasn't a flashy spy. He was the kind who slipped quietly through airports with a diplomatic bag and a story that couldn't be traced. But the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. In the chaos that followed, thousands of military men like Skripal were left clinging to disappearing loyalties. It was in this vulnerable time that Skripal, like many others, was approached by Western intelligence. Between 1995 and 2004, he secretly worked with MI6, Britain's foreign intelligence service. Hidden in this life were hotel meetings, encrypted calls, and dead drops. He gave MI6 the names of dozens, possibly hundreds, of Russian agents operating undercover across Europe. The kind of betrayal that the Kremlin considered a death sentence. In 2004, the trap closed. Skripal was arrested at his home in Moscow. Charged with high treason in the form of espionage, he confessed, possibly under duress, and was sentenced to 13 years in a high-security penal colony. He faded from public view, presumed to spend the rest of his life in prison. But in 2010, the world watched a different kind of spy drama unfold. 10 Russian agents were arrested in the US, including the glamorous Anna Chapman. A deal was brokered, a spy swap on the tarmac of Vienna airport. 4 men were exchanged, including Skripal. It was one of the biggest Cold War-style exchanges in decades. Sergei Skripal now belonged to Britain. He was quietly relocated to Salisbury, a quaint English city known more for its medieval cathedral than international espionage. He lived in a red brick house on Christie Miller Road. His daughter Yulia visited occasionally from Moscow. He shopped at the local Tesco, fed ducks in the park, and drank ale at the Mill pub. To the world, he was just another aging man walking slowly along cobbled streets. But he was still watching. Still listening. Still a man who knew things. The day of the attack, March 4, 2018. It was a chilly Sunday in Salisbury. People were out enjoying the stillness of the city, mothers pushing prams, couples sipping coffee outside Market Walk. But beneath this peaceful veneer, a deadly mission was already underway. Sergei had picked up Yulia from Heathrow just the day before. She'd flown in to surprise him. They talked about her life back in Russia, planned a quiet weekend, maybe some shopping, a nice meal. That morning, the two visited a local cemetery to pay respects to Sergei's wife and son, both of whom had died under murky circumstances, his wife of cancer in 2012, his son from liver failure in 2017. Some later suggested those deaths may not have been natural. Around 1:30 p.m., Sergei and Yulia went for lunch at Zitzi, an Italian restaurant near the heart of Salisbury. They ordered risotto and a glass of wine. Nothing seemed unusual until they left. At 4:15 p.m., a passerby noticed something strange. A man and a woman slumped together on a bench near the Maltings shopping center. The man's head was tilted back, his eyes wide and unmoving. The woman was twitching, her hands clenched. Vomit stained the pavement beneath them. The bystander called emergency services. What paramedics found was chilling. Sergei and Yulia were unresponsive. They weren't drunk. They weren't suffering a stroke. Something was shutting down their bodies from the inside, fast. The area was cordoned off, and both were rushed to Salisbury District Hospital. As the hours passed, their conditions worsened. Doctors realized they were dealing with something far beyond typical medicine. Blood tests showed signs of severe nerve agent poisoning. They were fighting for their lives, and no one yet knew why. Part 3: Novichok, the Invisible Assassin. Within 48 hours, British military scientists at Porton Down, just a few miles outside Salisbury, made a stunning discovery. The Skripals had been poisoned with a nerve agent from the Novichok family, a name that chilled every chemical weapons expert on Earth. Novichok, meaning newcomer in Russian, was developed in secret by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It was created specifically to bypass international chemical weapons treaties. Tasteless, odorless, and nearly undetectable, Novichok is between 5 and 10 times more deadly than VX gas. A pinhead-sized drop can kill. What's worse, it clings to surfaces for months. Weather doesn't break it down. If it's sprayed on a doorknob, anyone who touches it could die. Scientists concluded that the most likely method of delivery was through the front door handle of Skripal's home. The killer had walked up to that house in broad daylight and painted death on the doorknob. And it had worked. By the end of the week, the British government had declared this an attempted assassination, using a weapon of mass destruction, in the middle of an English town. It was an act of war by another name. The suspects, the botched cover-up, and the woman who would die for picking up a bottle. While Sergei and Yulia lay in induced comas, Salisbury was transforming into a war zone of forensic tents, hazmat suits, and men in gas masks. The media had caught wind of a chemical attack on UK soil. Locals were panicking. Zitsy and the Mill pub were sealed off. Parks were closed. More than 600 people who had been in the city centre were warned to wash their clothes and belongings. It sounded absurd, like something from a spy thriller. But it was real. Scotland Yard's Counter-Terrorism Command took over the investigation. Dozens of surveillance teams poured over 11,000 hours of CCTV footage. They analysed every arrival at Heathrow, every movement in Salisbury. Slowly, a pattern emerged. 2 men who had flown in from Moscow on March 2nd and left just 48 hours later. They went under the names Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Bosharov. Security footage showed them walking through Salisbury streets around the exact time the Skripals were poisoned. They claimed to be tourists. But why would tourists visit Salisbury on a freezing, wet Sunday? Why walk past the Skripal home more than once? Why fly in, spend one night in a budget hotel in East London, and leave almost immediately after the attack? The UK government made their move. On September 5, 2018, Prime Minister Theresa May stood in Parliament and made an explosive statement. Britain had identified 2 GRU officers, military spies working directly for the Russian state, as the attempted assassins of Sergei Skripal. Their mission: eliminate a traitor using an illegal nerve agent. But what followed was more surreal than serious. Just days later, the 2 suspects appeared on RT, Russia Today, a Kremlin-funded TV channel, and gave an interview. They were gym trainers, they said. They had traveled to Salisbury to see the cathedral's 123-meter spire and take in the historical charm. They denied being involved in any crime. The interview was widely mocked. It was filled with odd details, like their obsession with the spire, or how slushy the streets were. Bellingcat, the open-source investigation team, quickly proved their real names were Anatoly Chepiga and Alexander Mishkin, both decorated GRU agents, with military medals awarded personally by President Vladimir Putin. This wasn't a rogue operation. This was state-sponsored, and it had failed. But the failure didn't mean the danger was over. The bottle that killed an innocent woman. Months passed. Sergei and Yulia Skripal eventually awoke from their comas. They'd survived, but their lives would never be the same. The world moved on. Media attention faded. Salisbury tried to return to normal. Then, on June 30, 2018, the nightmare returned. In Amesbury, just 8 miles from Salisbury, Dawn Sturgess, a 44-year-old mother of 3, collapsed in her partner Charlie Rowley's flat. She began convulsing. Her pupils shrank to pinpricks. She vomited violently. Hours later, Charlie was also found unconscious. They were rushed to the same hospital where the Skripals had been treated. But this time, only one would survive. A week later, Dawn Sturgess died. She had been poisoned with Novichok. So how did it happen? Investigators traced the source. Charlie had found a small perfume bottle, still in a box, in a charity bin or park near Queen Elizabeth Gardens in Salisbury, an area near where the Russian agents had walked. The assassins had discarded the container after the attack. It looked brand new. Charlie gave it to Dawn as a gift. She sprayed it on her wrists. That single spray was enough to kill her. Charlie later said the liquid had a strange oily texture and that it made his fingers feel numb. He barely survived, enduring extensive physical and psychological damage. The perfume bottle had been a deadly delivery device, engineered by professionals, disguised as something ordinary. For Dawn, it was a random act of horror. A woman with no ties to espionage, dead simply because she crossed paths with discarded murder. The global fallout, diplomatic war, secret retributions, and unanswered questions. Dawn Sturgess's death shattered any remaining doubts. This wasn't just an attempted assassination, it was chemical warfare on British soil, with innocent lives caught in the blast radius. The British public, already shaken, now felt something more terrifying. This wasn't over. Prime Minister Theresa May faced Parliament again. This time, there was fire in her words. She formally declared the Russian state responsible, not just for targeting Sergei Skripal, but for causing the death of Dawn Sturgess and endangering thousands of civilians. And the world listened. Within days, the UK expelled 23 Russian diplomats identified as undeclared intelligence officers. It was the single largest expulsion since the Cold War. Russia retaliated in kind, ejecting 23 British envoys. But this time, it didn't stop there. Allies across the globe began closing ranks. The United States, Germany, France, Canada, Australia, and over 20 other nations expelled more than 150 Russian diplomats in solidarity with the UK. The NATO alliance publicly backed Britain's findings. Even traditionally cautious nations joined the chorus of condemnation. The Kremlin, meanwhile, denied everything. Russian state media mocked the UK's accusations. They suggested bizarre alternative theories. Maybe the Skripals poisoned themselves. Maybe it was food poisoning. Or maybe, and most insultingly, they were never poisoned at all. But intelligence agencies across the West had been watching. And they didn't buy the denials. Behind the scenes, a new Cold War began to simmer. Britain increased funding to MI6, GCHQ, and Porton Down. Cybersecurity was strengthened. Russian oligarchs in London suddenly found themselves under new scrutiny. Assets were frozen. Visas revoked. And somewhere deep in Moscow, someone had to explain why the hit had failed. And why the tools used had left fingerprints. The survivors who disappeared. Sergei Skripal survived, but he vanished. After being discharged from the hospital, he was moved to a secure location, likely under a new identity. The UK government provided him protection, fearing a second assassination attempt. Some reports claimed he wanted to return to espionage. Others said he'd been broken by the ordeal, living quietly, barely speaking, a ghost of the man he was. His daughter Yulia was last seen in a heavily controlled video statement in 2018, where she thanked the hospital staff and asked for privacy. There were rumors she wanted to return to Russia, but how could she? She had become a symbol, a pawn in a global game. Their lives had been stolen, not by death, but by silence and hiding. Dawn Sturgess, the forgotten victim. Of all the people touched by this tragedy, Dawn Sturgess became the most tragic emblem. She wasn't a spy. She didn't choose danger. She was a working-class woman, struggling with addiction, trying to rebuild her life. She'd just moved into a new flat. She was in love. Her partner Charlie Rowley was haunted by guilt. He'd given her the bottle, thinking it was perfume. He testified at her inquest, reliving the moment she sprayed it on her wrists and fell back, violently shaking. Her death raised hard questions. Why was the deadly bottle found months later? Had the search failed? Could she have been saved? Her family demanded justice, not just for Dawn, but for the failure to warn the public about what was still out there. A public inquest, and a cold conclusion. Years later, the public inquiry into the Salisbury poisonings began. It confirmed what the world already suspected: the GRU agents had used Novichok to try and kill Sergei Skripal. They had brought it in a perfume bottle disguised in luggage. They had thrown it away carelessly after the job. The inquiry's goal was to uncover who had authorized the hit. Experts pointed squarely to the highest levels of the Kremlin. The Russian government refused to cooperate. No suspects were extradited. No officials were punished. It became a cold truth: justice might never come. The town of Salisbury will never be the same. For centuries, it was a place of quiet reverence: cobblestone streets, the towering Salisbury Cathedral, pubs that dated back to the 1300s. But since 2018, it has lived under a shadow it didn't ask for. The locals still talk about that spring. The sirens. The police cordons. The soldiers in biohazard suits walking through shopping centers. It was like a film. But it wasn't fiction, it was the new face of modern espionage. The bench where Sergei and Yulia Skripal collapsed was removed. Zitzi, the Italian restaurant, closed for good. Their home on Christie Miller Road was deemed so contaminated that it was taken apart, piece by piece, by specialists in protective suits. Trees were cut down. Roof tiles disposed of. Months of decontamination followed, at a cost of tens of millions of pounds. Queen Elizabeth Gardens, where Dawn Sturgess likely encountered the discarded bottle, was closed for over a year. Tourists still visit Salisbury, but often now for a different reason: not just the cathedral's spire, but to see the city where a spy drama unfolded in real time. The modern battlefield: silent, chemical, undeclared. The Salisbury poisoning marked a turning point, not just in British history, but in global intelligence. It showed that Russia was willing to carry out state-sponsored killings abroad, using weapons banned by international treaties. It wasn't the first time. In 2006, Alexander Litvinenko had been poisoned in London with polonium-210, a radioactive isotope placed in his tea. But this was broader. Messier. Sloppier. Riskier. And it killed a civilian. It revealed a terrifying truth: the Cold War never really ended. It just changed uniforms. Now, assassinations are less likely to be done with bullets in dark alleys, and more likely to involve invisible poisons, deniable agents, and shadowy cyber fingerprints. The world is seeing more targeted killings, more cyber warfare, more psychological games. Intelligence experts called Salisbury a template, a warning for future operations. The message was clear: no one is untouchable. The aftermath for Britain. In the wake of the attack, the UK strengthened its Chemical Weapons Defence Centre at Porton Down, launched new protocols for detecting foreign agents, and ramped up counter-espionage efforts. MI6 expanded its operations, especially in Eastern Europe. Forensic science teams changed how they handled nerve agent cases. Hospitals were trained to detect symptoms of Novichok and other exotic poisons. It was a wake-up call. Not just about chemical threats, but about a new world order of grey warfare, conflict without declaration. Where are the killers now? The two GRU officers, Chepiga and Mishkin, remain under international arrest warrants. They are believed to be in Russia, under government protection. No extradition is possible. The Kremlin continues to deny all involvement, despite overwhelming evidence. Other GRU operations were later exposed across Europe. Cyber attacks, attempted assassinations, and sabotage plots were linked to the same unit that sent the men to Salisbury. It wasn't a one-off. It was a strategy. A city changed forever, and a world on guard. Today, if you walk through Salisbury, you won't see any chemical suits or police lines. The shops are open. The parks are green again. Children feed ducks in the River Avon. But ask any local, and they'll remember. They'll tell you about the day the ambulances came. The day no one knew if the air was safe. The day Russia left a fingerprint on a park bench. The story of the Salisbury poisoning isn't just a tale of espionage or revenge. It's the story of how a quiet city became a battleground for a silent war, and how, in an age of secrets and shadows, no one is truly safe.
Eye in the Sky Media.